Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 328. I'm the host Kyle Anzalone, joined today by co-host Connor Freeman. Connor, how you doing?
Doing great, Kyle. How are you?
Very good. Happy to have you back on. A lot to cover today, including Iran and more follow up on the death of an American journalist at the hands of Israeli forces. So, this is a really important story we'll be breaking down on today's show. Connor, just want to remind people that y'all can share the show. You find it at the libertarianinstitute.org, where I am the news editor. So, and Connor is one of our writers. So, just anytime, libertarianinstitute.org, you find my news stories there, Connor's featured articles, and the show all the time at the Institute. We also repost the show on the blog at antiwar.com, YouTube, Rumble, and Odysee for the video version of the show. And you can support the show by doing your CBD shopping through Paloma Verde, PalomaVerdeCBD.com, promo code PEACE. That will save you 20% off when you spend $75 or more. Connor, what are your favorite products at Paloma Verde?
I really like the tinctures. The one I've been digging a lot lately is the full spectrum oil. It's got a little bit of THC in there, so it just adds you some extra pain relief and helps with the inflammation, relax you a little bit. Yeah, I'm a huge fan of the soft gels. Take them after meals. I'll hit you in like a half hour. Any kind of pain, inflammation, stress, or anything you got going on that's preventing you from getting a good night's sleep, it'll help take care of that. If you're on the go, the gummy bears are your best bet because those will come in. They'll hit you instantly. And again, it has that same sort of thing where because you're ingesting it, that way it'll basically anything you've got. If you've got foot pain or if you've got shoulder pain, it's going to help that either way. And also the doggy treats are tremendous. If you've got a dog that's a little bit restless or they're just getting a little older and they need a little help because they have some joint pain, those are perfect too. And yeah, all that stuff is fantastic. But I really recommend people just scroll through, take a look at what's on sale, take a look at whatever, all the different categories that Carlos and the great people over there, Paloma Verde, have. It's the best CBD I've ever used. So can't recommend it enough, everybody. Check it out.
PalomaVerdeCBD.com, promo code PEACE. Connor, let's get into the news for today. The first story we have from the Libertarian Institute is titled, Congresswoman Demands Action After Report Finds Israel Intentionally Killed American Journalist. And so this is a update on the murder of Shireen Abu Akleh. I think it was May 11th. She was reporting from the Jenin refugee camp in the West Bank, the occupied territories of Israel. And her and three other journalists were I believe they initially drove past the soldiers that were set up, and then they were in an area where there was no militant activity. And a new report that has come out, it's a joint investigation from Forensic Architecture and AHA, and they, Al-Hal, her, I guess, is found that what happened was the four journalists are walking. The journalist in front sees fire going on and starts to run the opposite direction. In the first group of bullets, there were 6 shots fired, and then there's, I guess, a slight pause, and then there's, I think, 5 to 7 shots fired, and in that second burst of bullets is when Shireen is shot in the head and killed. And so it really seems like this is a situation, Connor, where these journalists were running away from the Israeli fire, and at the time that they were killed, and then there was a third group of shots that came in that was at the people trying to provide aid to Shireen, who was probably already dead at that time. So we write, Representative Rashida Tlaib is demanding an investigation into the murder of Al-Jazeera reporter Shireen Abu Akleh and for progressives to rethink their support for Israel. A recent report on the killing found that Israeli forces intentionally murdered the Palestinian-American journalist. On May 11th, Abu Akleh arrived at the Jenin refugee camp to document a raid carried out by Israeli forces. After arriving near the raid, Israeli forces opened fire on the journalist. The new joint investigation easily said Abu Akleh was easily identified as a journalist and she was not in the area of any militants when she was killed, and then described her killing as deliberate. The report documents the events that happened that I kind of already broke down here, Connor. So I won't go through all of those again. Tel Aviv has carried out their own investigation, claiming the killing was unintentional, but failed to explain how one of its soldiers fired over a dozen rounds at a group of journalists wearing helmets and bulletproof vests marked press. Since the killing, the State Department has met with the family of Abu Akleh and asked Israel to review its rules of engagement in the West Bank. Several top Israeli officials dismissed the American request. It's unlikely that the U.S. will attempt to leverage all the aid that it gives to Israel in order to get Israel to have any kind of reforms or any kind of justice for the American journalists. After the murder, President Joe Biden traveled to Israel and declared himself a proud Zionist. Biden said the U.S. relationship with the Jewish state is bone deep, ostensibly speaking for the vast majority of Americans. He emphatically stated that we are devoted to Israel's security without any ifs, ands, or buts, and without any doubt about it. Still, at least Congresswoman Tlaib is making a push for justice. An event hosted by Americans for Justice and Palestinian Action, she claims support for Israel should be a litmus test for progressives. If you want to know among progressives, it's become clear you cannot claim to hold progressive values and yet back Israel's apartheid government. And we will continue to push back and not accept this deal that you are progressive except for Palestine any longer. Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and the UN have all issued reports deeming Israel to be an apartheid state. The slaying of a veteran journalist, Abu Akleh, is just one example of how Tel Aviv suppresses Palestinian voices with impunity. And again, they do that gain $3.8 billion every year from the United States, just a massive amount of money. So the second article I have to talk about today, Connor, is the other one we wrote for the Libertarian Institute. It's titled NATO says China's role in Ukraine war shows why it is a challenge to the alliance. During remarks on Wednesday, the civilian head of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization slammed China as a challenge to the alliance. In an interview with Reuters, Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg said Beijing's support for the war in Ukraine, its opposition to NATO expansion, and its territorial claims justify the alliance assigning China with the label as a challenge. Largely in response to Washington's increasing hostility, Moscow and Beijing have strengthened their ties for well over a decade. Prior to the invasion of Ukraine, China and Russia carried out several rounds of joint military exercises. Russian President Vladimir Putin and Chinese President Xi Jinping have met several times since the war began, reaffirming the two Asian powers' growing ties. While Beijing has not given public support to Moscow's war, China has refused several demands to condemn Russia's invasion. Beijing has drastically increased its economic ties with Moscow as Russia has become more isolated from Western markets. After Moscow's invasion of Ukraine, Washington labeled massive sanctions on Russia, and many NATO member states agreed to scale back Russian energy purchases. The intention was to crush the Russian economy and disable the Kremlin's war machine. However, the Western economic war on Russia caused prices to spike, allowing Moscow to replace the shrinking European market with other Asian customers. While Russia is selling oil below market rates, Moscow increased exports to China, India, and Turkey, pushing the ruble to 7-year highs this summer. This is from Stoltenberg. The sum of all of this is an increase in importance of NATO allies standing together and realizing China is a part of the security challenges we need to face today and in the future. Meanwhile, India and Turkey have followed Beijing in importing more Russian goods. Ankara is a NATO member state. The U.S. and several other NATO members recently engaged in war games with India. And so it's interesting how China gets particularly singled out here, Connor, for doing the same thing that other nations are doing that we're actually increasing our security ties with. Stoltenberg also took issue with Beijing over its opposition to NATO expansion. At the fall of the USSR in 1990, the North Atlantic Alliance only had 16 members. In the 30 years since, NATO has added 14, soon to be 16 new members. Many of the new additions to the alliance are former Warsaw Pact or USSR states. Moscow's long protested NATO expansion. In 2008, the ambassador to Russia said expanding the alliance to Georgia violated all of Russia's red lines. NATO has expanded its global reach. This week, NATO members, the U.S. and Canada, conducted a joint transit through the Taiwan Strait. Last year, eyeing Beijing and following Washington's imperial lead, British, French, and German warships sailed through the South China Sea. This year, NATO targeted China in its new strategic concept document. UK Prime Minister Liz Truss has even openly called for a global NATO to defend Taiwan and confront China in the Asia Pacific. Under Truss, Beijing will be classified as a threat to England's national security for the first time for a tougher approach to Beijing, the Times reported this month. In his first congressional address, Biden boasted he told President Xi that we will maintain a strong military presence in the Indo-Pacific, just as we do in NATO, with NATO in Europe. So Connor, increasing a lot of hostilities here, and I just want to turn it over for you for the Iran report. I know we are going to start off here with the article you wrote for the Libertarian Institute last week, titled "Majority of IAEA Board of Governors Support Western Statement Against Iran." I think your mic's off, Connor. You might have yourself muted.
Yeah, so this is from last Thursday. This came out actually shortly after we recorded our last show. So, after there was the censuring last June at the IAEA Board of Governors, this non-binding statement was issued. So 2/3 of the UN Nuclear Watchdog's Board of Governors, which is comprised of 35 nations, endorsed a non-binding statement pressuring Iran. And this was, again, from Reuters. And this comes as Washington is expanding, of course, the maximum pressure campaign, which is devastating the Iranian civilian population. And we just keep seeing more sanctions get piled on here. And just further and further proof that the U.S. is unwilling to negotiate a return to the deal. Now, any remaining hopes of reviving the JCPOA continue dwindling. But on Wednesday, the statement that was put forward by the U.S., Britain, France, and Germany, on Wednesday, I should say, it was put forward by the U.S., Britain, France, and Germany, and it presses Tehran to explain why, again, these trace uranium particles that were discovered years ago at these 3 undeclared sites were there. Now, earlier in the year, Iran made an agreement we've discussed before with the Vienna-based IAEA to provide full documentation on the situation, hoping to resolve the issue finally. However, under the influence of Washington, the IAEA has refused to change its position and maintains that Tehran is being uncooperative. So in June, as some more background, the U.S. and the E3 put forward a resolution expressing profound concern, censuring Iran for its ostensible non-cooperation. And the resolution passed with 3 abstentions, and only Russia and China opposed the measure. The IAEA claims that there has been no progress or engagement with Iran since then. And at the same time, the Iranians described the resolution as unconstructive and disconnected several IAEA cameras from its nuclear sites in response. The monitoring agreement the IAEA had with Iran over the footage that was being voluntarily collected, though, had long expired at that point. And in order for a new monitoring agreement to be made between Tehran and the IAEA, we would have to see Biden and Washington return to the JCPOA. Iran is still complying, this is critical, with its IAEA safeguards agreement as it has been a 52-year signatory of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Now, this week's statement reaffirms support, or last week's statement, I should say, reaffirmed support for the previous resolution. They said, quote, "We call upon Iran to act immediately to fulfill its legal obligations without delay, take up the IAEA Director General's offer of further engagement to clarify and resolve all outstanding safeguards issues." And that statement was presented by Berlin to the board. Now, far fewer countries endorsed Wednesday's statement, or last week's statement again, than voted for the original June resolution. And again, Russia and China were against this statement as well as the previous resolution. Now, Tehran has, of course, called for the probe to end, and they say that by providing all documents related to the undeclared sites already to the UN watchdog, they've fulfilled their obligations. And at any rate, those particles pose no known proliferation risk. There remains enormous pressure from the Israelis on both the Americans and the Europeans to refuse to accept Iran's explanations or to close the probe. Iranian President Ibrahim Raisi has said, in order for the JCPOA to succeed, this endless IAEA inquiry must end. The E3, that's France, Britain, and Germany, recently issued a joint statement saying that this demand indicates that Iran is not serious about nuclear negotiations. Though Tehran remains in the deal, and though the Europeans do ostensibly as well, they've for years and years now left their obligations to it almost entirely unfulfilled, totally. So Israeli Prime Minister Yair Lapid recently visited Germany to pressure Berlin not to support a revival of the nuclear deal. As a result, you have Chancellor Olaf Scholz saying he believes the JCPOA will not be restored anytime soon. And in recent weeks, Tel Aviv has dispatched multiple top national security officials to Washington, partly to ensure that the probe continues indefinitely. And the subject of how the particles were discovered is still, a matter of debate. It's still very questionable. The sites were discovered after the Israelis presented the IAEA with secret intelligence. And the IAEA, of course, has no safeguards agreement with Tel Aviv because of its large clandestine nuclear weapons arsenal, which also makes all the billions in yearly U.S. aid to Tel Aviv illegal. All right. So we have from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com, again on the 15th, Benny Gantz, the Israeli defense minister, saying that the Iran nuclear deal is in the ER room. Almost doing a victory lap here. So as the chances of reviving the Iran nuclear deal appear more unlikely with each passing week, Israeli Defense Minister Benny Gantz says, quote, the Iran nuclear deal seems like it is in the ER room. Gantz said this at Reichman University in Herzliya, Israel, according to Reuters. Quote, there's a period maybe after the elections. We'll see how it goes, Gantz said, referring to the U.S. midterm elections that will be held in November, of course. An unnamed Israeli official told reporters earlier this week that a deal was unlikely before the U.S. midterms. And earlier in the week, as we covered on the show, on the last show that we did, we have Blinken saying that he thinks it's unlikely that there will be an agreement here. And that's the clearest indication yet from the Biden regime that the deal won't happen. Blinken, of course, blames Iran and tries to echo this narrative that falsely portrays Iran as the unwilling party. And as the Biden White House continues to ramp up all these sanctions, we even see in recent weeks, the Wall Street Journal has reported that recently, the Wall Street Journal reported that Biden's team is considering even sanctioning Iran over the stabbing of Salman Rushdie, the author, even though Iran denies involvement. And, there's no proof. I have a quote here from Dave DeCamp here where he says, former Iranian Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khomeini did call for Rushdie's death back in the 80s, but there's no evidence linking Tehran to his recent stabbing, which was carried out by a 24-year-old Lebanese American. Now, Ibrahim Raisi, this was at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. This is another one from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. Iran's Raisi tells Putin cooperation makes U.S. sanctioned countries stronger. And this dovetails with what Kyle has been covering on the last few shows. But just to reiterate the some of the Iran news here, we have while at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization summit in Samarkand, Uzbekistan, Iran's President Ibrahim Raisi and his Russian President Vladimir Putin discussed the growing relationship among countries targeted by American sanctions regimes. Quote, the relationship between countries that are sanctioned by the U.S., such as Iran, Russia, or other countries, can overcome many problems and issues and make them stronger, Raisi said, according to the AFP. He said the Americans think whatever country they impose sanctions on, it will be stopped. Their perception is a wrong one, the Iranian leader added. And, of course, Iran signed a memorandum of obligations to become a permanent member of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Asian Security and Economic Bloc, aimed at countering Western influence in the region. Its members include Russia, China, India, Pakistan, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan. And as Dave writes here, he says, facing similar pressure from the West, Russia, China, and Iran have forged closer ties in recent years. Tehran is looking to increase trade with countries in the SCO as it remains under heavy sanctions and is isolated from the U.S.-led global financial system. Now, Iran has said that they are ready to implement a prisoner swap with the U.S. And this is another one from antiwar.com by Dave. He says the Iranian Foreign Ministry said Sunday that it is prepared to implement a prisoner exchange deal with the U.S. and that it's up to Washington to make the swap happen. Iranian Foreign Ministry spokesman Nasser Kanani said that an agreement has already been reached. Quote, "We have already voiced our readiness to exchange prisoners with the U.S. We are still ready to do so. Negotiations have been conducted in different ways over the matter, and parties have reached the necessary agreements," Kanani said, according to Iran's MEHR news agency. And it's now up to the U.S. administration to decide whether it wants to implement this agreement or not. We are prepared to enforce it, he said. And Dave writes, according to MEHR, the prisoner swap deal was reached on the sidelines of the nuclear deal negotiations that were held in Vienna. Several U.S. citizens are detained in Iran, and Tehran seeks the release of Iranians that have been arrested inside the U.S., mostly for alleged sanctions violations. Last month, Kanani made a similar call and said Tehran wants to help Iranians that had quote, fallen victim to the injustice practiced by the U.S. legal establishment based on the hollow accusation of them violating the oppressive and illegal American sanctions. The chances of the U.S. and Iran, of course, reaching an agreement to revive the JCPOA seem unlikely, but the two countries have previously separated the two issues. There was even a prisoner swap in 2019, only a year after the Trump administration withdrew illegally from the Iran nuclear deal and reimposed sanctions. Okay, so there's some interesting notes here in another article here by Dave DeCamp. It's Iran doesn't rule out holding nuclear deal talks on sidelines of UN General Assembly, and this was from the 19th. So the Iranian Foreign Ministry did not rule out the possibility of holding some nuclear deal talks on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly in New York. Quote, Ali Bagheri Khani, this is Kanani again, the Foreign Ministry spokesman. He said that Ali Bagheri Khani, the chief nuclear negotiator, will be present at the General Assembly as part of the delegation, but there is no specific plan to discuss the nuclear deal. However, he said, I do not rule out the possibility of talks regarding the nuclear deal. Kanani reiterated that Iran is still open to negotiations, and during a recent interview with 60 Minutes, Iranian President Ibrahim Raisi said that the U.S. needs to provide some sort of guarantees that it won't withdraw from the JCPOA again. He said, quote, it needs to be lasting. There need to be guarantees. If there were a guarantee, then the Americans could not withdraw from the deal. Now, because Biden doesn't have the power to guarantee that a future administration wouldn't reimpose sanctions on Tehran, in recent negotiations, Iran was reportedly seeking a series of measures meant to deter the U.S. from withdrawing from the deal. And this relates to some of the insurance policies we've gotten into about centrifuges being left in a state where they could be brought back online within a year. Just, again, sort of nonviolent sort of leverage, by expanding the nuclear program, as a reaction to economic war, and let alone all the Israeli assassinations and covert attacks. And so it looked like, I think one of the reasons why it seemed like we got closer here to a deal than previously under the Biden administration is to some degree because Iran did expand. Well, they enriched uranium hexafluoride to 60% and had been enriching uranium to 20%, the tetrafluoride for the Tehran Medical Research Reactor. As much as the Americans like to act like their sanctions are what bring the Iranians to the table, it's often the other way around. And also, of course, the Europeans this time around really did need another crude oil supplier. But it looks like the American and Israeli pressure has been enough to prevent them from really moving that much further forward to try and seal the deal. Now, Raisi did meet with Macron and discuss the nuclear deal at the UN General Assembly. This is from the 20th, again, at antiwar.com by Dave DeCamp. He says Raisi held a meeting with French President Emmanuel Macron on Tuesday on the sidelines of the General Assembly to discuss the deal. And Raisi conveyed to Macron that one of Iran's concerns was over the IAEA inquiry into these traces of uranium at the undeclared nuclear sites. The Iranian leaders said that the IAEA investigation has been subject to pressure from other countries. According to Al-Jazeera, Raisi told Macron the agency's approach toward technical issues must be away from pressures by others, and we believe that achieving an agreement will not be possible without closing Iran's cases. And he continued, Europe must show in action that its policies are separate from those of the U.S. and does not follow the wishes and policies of the U.S. Iran and the agency are able to resolve existing cases, and we won't exert political pressure on the agency on this issue. Now, that's what they're quoting Macron as saying at the meeting on Raisi's website. So Iranian officials also met with EU officials, of course, as the EU has been the main brokers here. Well, they're the ones who've kept the deal from dying by reviving it time and again here over the last few months. But it looks like they might have done all they can do, but maybe there's something else that can still be done. They've had some success when it looked like all hope was lost in the last couple of months. So also on Tuesday, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said that he didn't expect any breakthroughs on the deal to come through at the General Assembly. Okay, now Raisi says, this is from today at antiwar.com. Dave wrote this one up. Raisi says Iran's ready for nuclear deal, questions U.S. commitment. So Raisi addressed the UN General Assembly in New York yesterday, and he said his country is serious about reviving the nuclear deal and questioned U.S. commitments to the agreement. Raisi said the U.S. would need to make a commitment to the deal so that it doesn't withdraw again as the Trump administration did 4 years ago. Actually, it's a little bit more than 4 years ago now, 2018, May in 2018. Quote, our wish is only one thing, commitment, observance of commitments, Raisi said. Can we truly trust without guarantees and assurances that the U.S. will this time live up to their commitment? And as Dave writes, guarantees have been a major sticking point, as Biden doesn't have the power to ensure that a future administration will stay in the deal. But what exactly Raisi wants from the U.S. when it comes to guarantees isn't clear. During negotiations with the previous Iranian government, this is the so-called moderates led by President Rouhani, Iran asked President Biden if he could guarantee the U.S. that they wouldn't leave the JCPOA again during his term, just during his first term in office. And, notoriously Biden refused and the talks failed. So there's also some what appear to be some significant protests going on in Iran after the death of a young woman who I believe was in the custody or was being held by the morality police. And now it looks like there's some pretty considerable protests going on. I know that the U.S. just imposed new sanctions again on the morality police. And I'm seeing a lot of rhetoric that with what's going on and all the social unrest out there, that can we even, should we take the JCPOA off the table or take the deal off the table? Does this make it even more unlikely? So I'm sure it'll be used as more ammunition for the Hawks to justify walking away. I'm going to wait a little while and cover these protests here next week, just so we can wait for some more of the facts to come out. And, but, at the end of the day, it's really terrible because if the U.S. would just return to the deal and lift sanctions, opening up Iran to Western markets would have a great effect on the Iranian people, I think, because on the one hand, the things that we nominally are committed to in the West, like freedom of speech, and equality among the sexes and free expression and all these different things, that would have an enormous that would have a very positive effect, which is why libertarians and Ron Paulians have always said that the best foreign policy we could possibly have would be diplomacy, free trade, cultural exchange, and free travel. So all this is going to be used, of course, to just demonize Iran, when meanwhile our sanctions have destroyed their economy and half the people live below the poverty line and the inflation rate is near 50%. Of course, we've seen that food insecurity in some areas has reached 60%. So. And we also know that a lot of these people, like Richard Nephew, are pleased to see when a lot of these incidents, or when there's social unrest and protests and chaos going on in countries that are targeted, for these economic wars, like Iran has been for so long. So when we return, we'll have more news on that, and yeah, again, it just is not looking good. I don't believe they're going to return to the deal, but we'll see. It sounds like if hopefully something came out of those discussions with the EU, they have been able, like I said, to kind of restart talks when they looked like they were dead in recent months. So we'll see.
All right, Connor, thank you for that update. Everybody, thanks for listening to the show. Get all of your foreign policy news from antiwar.com and the Libertarian Institute, and just share support wherever you can for conflicts of interest. Get your CBD through Paloma Verde, PalomaVerdeCBD.com, promo code PEACE. Thanks, Connor.
Thank you, Kyle. Thank you, everybody.